Welcome everyone. We're just going to give a second for folks to join us in the room, and we'll get started with our virtual Budget Advocacy Day prep webinar. Thank you for being here. All right, I think we'll get started as people are joining us in the room. Hello everyone, my name is Keegan Burke. I'm a Training and Capacity Building Coordinator at NYSCADV. We'd like to welcome you to the 2022 Virtual Budget Advocacy Day prep webinar. I'm just going to go over a couple housekeeping items as we get started today. We are providing live captioning for today's training, so I'd like to thank our transcribers right from the start. To turn on captioning, you can click the CC button in your toolbar and the caption will appear in the presentation window. We have cameras turned off for this webinar, so you don't have to worry about that. We will be recording, so I'll start the recording soon after I finish this housekeeping. You can put any question or comment in the chat box. That's how we'll have you engage, and we'll answer those throughout the webinar. If you have any technical difficulties or would like to ask a question or comment anonymously, you can feel free to message me directly, Keegan Burke, in the chat, and I will read out your question anonymously. We're really grateful that you're here today, and I will pass it off to our hosts, and looks like we are already recording, so we're all set. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Keegan. Hello, everyone, welcome. I'm Joan Gerhardt, the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at NYSCADV, and I want to welcome you here today. It's snowy where I am, so I hope maybe you're dealing with weather inside and you're nice and toasty and warm to join us today. We are experiencing some signal issues with the internet because of the weather. My internet seems to be fine, and I am going to be presenting the material today, but let me apologize in advance if we do have any difficulties. We'll get the webinar back up and running as soon as we can. So with that, I'd like to welcome you again to our prep webinar for our February 15th Budget Advocacy Day. I'd like to start by walking us through some of the objectives for today's webinar. We certainly want to review what our recommendations are for this year's state budget, really from the perspective of what we want legislators to know about these recommendations and requests. We want to walk through our toolkit and materials so that you know what is available to you to make it easier to participate in this year's virtual Budget Advocacy Day. And we also want to know what more we can be doing at NYSCADV to support your activities. You know, we really don't want this to be burdensome. We want it to be as easy as possible for you to reach out and to elevate the voices of survivors to the legislature. And finally, we want to address any questions that you have, whether it's logistical questions or questions about your legislators, questions about the materials. We want to be sure that you, again, have what you need. So just a few comments about our virtual event this year. This is another year of virtual activities for NYSCADV, unfortunately. I do think the virtual events do provide some benefits for us. You know, certainly we know more advocates can participate when we're not all required to come to Albany, particularly on a day like today with a lot of weather. So, you know, it does heighten the level of participation. And I think from an advocate standpoint, you know, it's also a way for you to decide for yourself how much time you have in your day to invest in Budget Advocacy Day activities, as well as how you want to participate, what technologies you want to use, whether it's asking for virtual meetings with legislators, sending them information by email, maybe picking up the phone and talking to them, or staff, and certainly participating in social media to raise awareness about our recommendations as well as the needs of survivors. And, you know, what I'm also finding, even, you know, now that we're almost 2 years into this pandemic, legislators are more accessible to us in this virtual environment, somehow without all of the pressures of, competing interests banging on the door in their Albany offices. Having a few minutes for a virtual meeting does center them a little bit more, allows them to focus. And I find that more legislators are participating in meetings rather than, having someone else in their staff meet with us. So that's a benefit as well. And I want to make sure you all understand why your voice is so important and why your participation is so important. We know that legislators can't be experts on all the issues in front of them. They have a lot of folks coming into their office talking about a wide variety of issues, and they can't possibly understand all of these issues with a deep level, of knowledge. That's what they need us for. So we're there to make sure when they're particularly in the role of decision making on the issues that, center on us, whether it's survivors and their needs or the needs of service providers, that they really understand our perspective and we can make them more knowledgeable and informed. We're also the best people to personalize the issue for legislators by telling them, direct experiences of survivors, of course, keeping confidentiality intact, but talking generally about survivors' experiences, the challenges of running programs to provide services. We know particularly now there's a lot of day-to-day challenge with the work that we're doing. And I think when we draw those experiences, those local experiences in our conversations with legislators, it really personalizes it for them and it makes them remember. It's much more tangible to them than speaking in generalities. And we know that legislators really like to work to meet with constituents, to hear from us and to learn from us. That's what they want to do. They want to be accountable to their constituents, whether it's people who live in their district or people who work in their district, or maybe both. It's really in their best interest to understand the needs of their constituents and to speak to them. So a couple of words about our budget process in New York State. This is an annual process that we go through every year. The governor kicks off the budget process with the issuance of an executive budget in January. So that's already occurred. And the budget has two parts. We're pretty familiar with a budget being, the numbers, all of the appropriations. And the way that the state budget is broken out is in various budget bills that describe appropriations for all of the different state agencies in our state. But there's also another piece to the budget, which is referred to as the Article 7's policies. And those are really the opportunity for the governor to put policy or legislation into the budget. So if you think about, the way we typically think about legislation and its crafting and construction, it's usually at the behest of a legislator who drafts a bill and then speaks to the other chamber, gets an identical bill introduced in the other chamber, the chambers pass the bill, and then that bill goes to the governor to be signed. This process, the Article 7 process, sort of reverses that. So the legislation crafting begins with the governor. She puts it in her executive budget, and then the legislature responds by either accepting that policy in the budget, removing it from the budget, or tweaking it. And that's another piece of the negotiation that goes on in the budget process. So once the executive budget is introduced, then the legislature takes a number of actions in response. They hold joint budget hearings, which are actually just wrapping up now. There are conference committees on particular issues that could involve members of both chambers. And then once the legislature is done with their analysis and review, each chamber, the Assembly and Senate, will develop a response to the executive budget, a written document referred to as a resolution that informs the governor on the reaction of that chamber to her executive budget. And then the real negotiation begins between the governor, the assembly, and the Senate. And that's usually focused on the chamber leaders, the majority leader, the speaker of the assembly, to negotiate with the governor to get to a final budget. And that budget is due on April 1st, which is the beginning of each fiscal year in New York State. So our current budget, which was finalized last April, April 2021, continues until March 30th of 2022. So we have 3 requests this year on the appropriation side. And this is a summary slide of those 3 requests. We're going to be getting into each of these requests in a little more detail. But the 3 requests are to earmark $25 million for the State Office of Victim Services to extend contracts with victim assistance providers. And this gets to the issue of the VOCA cuts, which you're probably familiar with. Our second request is to increase the TANF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, set aside for non-residential domestic violence services to $6 million. That might sound a little familiar to those of you who have participated in Budget Advocacy Day activities in the past. And our third appropriations request is to maintain a $5 million appropriation for OCFS to implement a pilot of a new funding model for domestic violence programs. So let's unpack each of these requests and start with the first one, earmarking the $25 million to extend current contracts with victim assistance providers. So as you likely know, we've heard from the Office of Victim Services, who is the administrator in New York State of the federal VOCA funds, the Victims of Crime Act funding, that they're going to be cutting funding to all victim assistance providers in New York State. That's more than 300 providers. And what we heard from OVS is that all programs should expect to be cut at least 10 to 15%. Now, since VOCA is for many programs their primary source of funding, any cut to this funding is significant. We also know that OVS already canceled existing contracts with civil legal service providers. And these are civil legal services provided specifically for victims of New York State. So OVS told these providers that their 5th and final year of the contracts, which were set to begin in October of 2022 and extend into 2023, will not be satisfied. So these cuts affect all victim assistance providers, not just domestic violence providers, but domestic violence, sexual violence, child advocacy centers, even prosecution-based support services for victims, a wide array of victim services in New York State. Now, these cuts, OVS, I think, doesn't want to cut funding for all of these programs. There's a basis for why they're saying they need to cut the funding, and that's because of the federal funding coming into New York State. And before I get into that, I do see some action in the chat. Okay, from Carla. I'll explain the difference from 140 to 25 in a moment. So I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. So the federal VOCA grant that comes into New York State, every state in the country gets a VOCA grant, and that comes to us from the federal government. And this next slide shows you the trend in the amount of money of our VOCA grant since 2018. Now, these numbers on the slide might be a little small for you to see, but it's really most important for you to see the trend. So the column on the left is the amount of the VOCA grant in 2018. And at that point in time, it was just shy of $200 million. The column on the right shows the amount of our VOCA grant in New York in 2021. And that number was just shy of $60 million. So in the last 4 years, the amount of federal funding coming into New York in its VOCA grant has decreased $140 million. So that's where that $140 million comes from. Now, we certainly understand that OVS can't do the same amount of support for providers with $60 million that they were able to do with $140 million. I'm sorry, with $200 million. So a decrease of $140 million, you can't do the same amount of work with that. So that's where the $140 million comes from. Now, Congress at the federal level has taken action to get the VOCA grants going out to New York, to all states to increase. And that was last year's passage of the VOCA fix legislation that you might be familiar with. So at the federal level, the fund that fuels all of the VOCA grants is called the Crime Victims Fund. And because of changes or strategies for going after white collar criminals at the federal level, the amount of money that was in the Crime Victims Fund had been rapidly decreasing year over year. So that level of funding at the federal level decreased. So in turn, the amount of funding that went out to the states in VOCA grants decreased, as seen on the earlier slide. Now with the VOCA fix legislation, there will be more money going into the Crime Victims Fund from the general revenues at the federal level, federal budget, into the Crime Victims Fund. And we've seen that change already having a positive effect on the level of deposits going into the Crime Victims Fund. So from September to December of 2021, there was $350 million deposited into the Crime Victims Fund, a number that well exceeded the months prior. So this is a really good change. We're moving in the right direction. But when you think about what the amount of money that's needed to change the trend on VOCA grants across the entire country, we're talking about billions of dollars, not millions. So it's projected to take 2 to 3 years for enough money to go into the Crime Victims Fund to allow state VOCA grants to increase. So that's the period of time that we're in right now. We have the fix at the federal level, but we know it's going to take some time for that Crime Victims Fund to be replenished. In the interim, we're asking New York State to cover this change in funding, to cover the shortfall. We know the money is not coming in from the federal government, but we also understand how important and critical these services are for victims, and New York State should understand that as well. So we're asking for $25 million in this year's budget to extend the current contracts that OVS has with all victim assistance providers, keep everyone whole. So the difference between the $140 million and this $25 million request is that the $140 million represents the decrease in the last 4 years of New York's VOCA grant, but $25 million is our best estimate of the shortfall at OVS right now, which is why they're asking for, they're telling providers to expect a 10 to 15% decrease in funding. Now, I wish I had confirmation from OVS that $25 million was what they in fact needed to extend all current contracts. But despite foiling the information from OVS, we've been unable to get any documentation that that's the actual number. So it's a good guess, but I did want to caveat that we're not exactly sure what that shortfall at OVS is. Now, New York State is really well positioned to spend $25 million, a small fraction of this $216 billion budget that's proposed by the governor, to make sure that our victim services in New York State continue and are sustainable. Many states have already taken proactive action to ensure the viability of victim services in their states. So just to give you an idea, Texas has set aside $160 million, California, $100 million, Maryland, $14 million, Washington State, $15 million. So other states have taken proactive steps to ensure that funding is not cut to their victim services, while at the federal level, the Crime Victims Fund is able to replenish itself. So we know New York State can do it. We know there's a state surplus in New York State. We know there's billions of pandemic relief funding available to New York State. There's no reason why New York State is not taking this action to protect our victim services in New York. So this is by far the most important priority for us as in terms of our budget requests this year. So before I go on to our other requests, I just want to make sure that there's nothing in the chat. Brittany Goati is watching the chat for us today. Brittany, is there anything I need to respond to?
Nope.
Okay, thank you. All right, so if folks have more questions about the VOCA issue and our request for $25 million, please put that in the chat. But I will say we're doing a lot of advocacy at NYSCADV along with other victim assistance providers. We're collaborating very closely with NYSCASA and with the New York Legal Services Coalition, as well as the New York State Children's Alliance, to get this message to the governor and to the legislature. But we could really appreciate your help as well. So our second, yes.
There's one question that just came in. Is there a reason that we know of that OVS is not sharing what the shortfall is?
No, no. And actually it doesn't really speak to this, transparent government that the governor has spoken quite a bit about with her administration, wanting activities and issues like this to be really clear and transparent to the public. I believe OVS had 5 days to respond to our FOIL request. We're way beyond that. We reached out to Elizabeth Cronin, the director, with a personal request because the legislature actually asked us the specific question after we testified at the public protection budget hearing. So it's a bit unusual, frankly, for us not to have this information concretely understood. But to the best of our analysis, I think $25 million is a good number. I wouldn't have put that number out there if I wasn't sure that it should cover the contracts. I'd like us to use that number in our advocacy with the legislature because I think it's easier for them to get around what we're really asking for. If we just go in there with saying, we don't know what the number is, but please help us. It's a little vague for them. But I do want to be clear with everyone here that we don't have written confirmation from OVS that 25 million is the right number. Okay, so John is asking if I'll be talking about the social media, Twitter. Yes, I will, John. I'll get to that. So let's move on to our second budget request, which is about TANF and a set aside for non-residential domestic violence services, which has been in place for many years. Like I said earlier, for those of you who have been engaged in Budget Advocacy Day activities in the past, this is probably an issue that you're well familiar with. Back in the year 2000, the legislature and governor at that time saw fit to take a portion of the TANF funding, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families funding, and set it aside specifically for non-residential domestic violence services. And this is some of the money that counties use to enter into contracts with local not-for-profits for the provision of these non-residential domestic violence services. That amount of money, the $3 million, has essentially stayed the same in 22 years. It's had a little bumps up, a few bumps down, but for the most part, it's been $3 million. Last year's budget, the final budget, included one of these small increases of $200,000. So the actual final number last year was 3.2 million. This year's executive budget, the governor suggested reducing the amount of money back to $3 million. So we've lost a little bit of ground in the executive budget proposal. We're asking for that to increase to 6 million, the same request we've had for several years. There's a number of reasons why we're asking for $6 million. First, based on an analysis that's done every year by a national not-for-profit called the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. They do a fact sheet on TANF for every state. And according to that center, New York has not spent almost $900 million of its TANF grant. Now, there are reasons for states to reserve some of the TANF funding to ensure that, if needed for a crisis, they can draw upon it. But $897 million, that's 37% of our overall grant that New York State is holding in reserves. So when you think about an increase from 3 million to 6 million, that's again a very small fraction of what New York State is holding in reserves. So the money is there, it's available. We just have to get New York State to release it. If $3 million that was appropriated back in the year 2000, what kept up with inflation, kept pace with inflation, that fund would now be at $4.6 million. So again, you can't do as much, with $3 million today as you did back in the year 2000. This funding needs to keep pace with inflation. And we also know there's a heightened demand, even before the pandemic, but certainly during the pandemic, for non-residential services. And this is just another example of New York State prioritizing residential services over non-residential services, which is not to say non-residential services is not needed in New York State, but we also know the growing need for non-residential services on the part of survivors and their families. So in order to account for the heightened demand for non-residential services and for inflation, we'd like to see the set aside for non-residential services increase to $6 million. Our third budget request relates to finding a new way to fund domestic violence services in New York State. So we've been engaged in discussions as a community of advocates along with the legislature and with state agencies about the way New York funds domestic violence programs. And we now believe that the state is positioning itself to transform this fairly antiquated system, it's been around for 35 years or so, into something that's much more innovative and survivor-centered and trauma-informed. Because we know all of the challenges that exist with the current per diem reimbursement model. That's not to suggest that it doesn't work for everyone. In fact, we think there are some programs that like the per diem reimbursement model. But the issue is that it doesn't fairly represent what's happening in programs statewide. Some programs, particularly those that are smaller, that don't operate with high occupancy rates or have occupancy rates that fluctuate throughout the year within shelter, find it very difficult to forecast revenue under the per diem system. We know that when there are challenges like the pandemic, or when ICE comes into a community, the immigration folks come into the community, there are survivors who don't want to go into congregate care settings for those reasons. So there's lots of external factors that affect the number of survivors utilizing shelter at any given time. And to make that mechanism be the priority for funding is problematic. Of course, there's also all of the administrative burden attached with trying to hunt down payment once you've already expended funds, for a survivor stay and shelter, to then get that reimbursement sometimes months later, as local counties sort of duke it out on who's responsible for a survivor's stay. So a lot of challenges with respect to the current system. New York State has agreed in concept to pilot a new funding model. We don't have any kind of detail on how that pilot would be implemented. We asked OCFS about it a couple of weeks ago, and they said they still don't have a plan. Certainly we know that the pandemic put these plans on hold, but it doesn't change the need to really look at, evaluate, and analyze what might be a better system for funding domestic violence services in New York State. So we're happy to see that the governor included an additional $5 million in this year's executive budget for this pilot, which hasn't gotten off the ground yet. This would add to the $10 million that were already set aside in the last two budgets for this pilot. So we would have a total of $15 million to conduct the pilot. And we think that's a nice pot of money where we can really do some good work to assess our funding model. So now I'm going to move away from appropriations and focus a bit on the Article 7 side of the budget. The governor did include a bunch of proposals, Article 7 proposals in this year's budget, a couple of which do relate specifically to domestic violence, but I'd like to focus on one in particular today, which is in the Public Protection and General Government Budget Bill, which we fondly call the PPGG budget, and it's referred to as Part H. So essentially that proposal would mandate, require all current and future domestic violence advocates to obtain a 40-hour training. And once they obtained that 40-hour training, you would be certified to provide domestic violence services. The proposal does describe specific training topics for the 40-hour training that would be enumerated in statute. It does apply to both paid and volunteer staff, and it exempts staff who have completed a DOH-approved rape crisis training from this future, as yet to be developed domestic violence training. In addition, it creates under OPDV's umbrella a gender-based violence training institute. And OPDV envisions hiring 3 full-time employees to work in that institute to focus on developing the training, this 40-hour training, offering the training, as well as developing continuing ed programming. So I want to start by making clear that we're not aware of any meaningful discussions that the state had, certainly not with NYSCADV or with advocates throughout the state on this proposal. We saw it when you saw it. We weren't aware it was going to be in the executive budget. So we're in a position now of responding to this proposal that was really developed without our input and feedback. And I think to a certain extent, it suffers from that lack of collaboration. So, we might agree that training should be a little more consistent statewide. We could agree that right now, during this sort of great resignation that companies and not-for-profits are having to deal with throughout New York State, that it's really a challenge for programs to onboard new employees and to train them in a timely way so that they can get going and provide services. But we're not sure that this proposal is really the best way to go about that. First, the proposal brings in DOH into the mix of state agencies that are now responsible in some shape or form for the funding or regulation of domestic violence programs. So we know, I'm sure you know, all of the state agencies that we deal with, right? All the O's, OCFS, OTDA, OVS, DCJS, OPDV. Now we're going to have DOH over us as well, working with OPDV, OCFS, and OVS on this training. And the proposal specifically says DOH is responsible for the rules and regulations related to this training. So we're not quite sure how that meshes with OCFS's current responsibilities for training, setting requirements for training of staff in DV programs. And the proposal doesn't speak to OCFS's role. So we know OCFS is responsible for licensing and approving programs, and they're responsible for setting regulations for those DV programs. But this proposal envisions training and certification for the staff of those programs falling under OPDV. We don't think that bureaucracy is necessary. We also think it would be very confusing to have OCFS training regulations, which now it's a minimum requirement of 12 hours for domestic violence advocates before they can perform services. And we know most advocates get far more training than that. But this is now a mandate. This would be a mandate, if approved, that everyone before they start providing services would have to complete an OPDV provided 30-hour training, and then in their first year, complete an additional 10 hours of training. We also don't think the proposal really considers the role that NYSCADV has for training and TA of domestic violence service providers. So again, that's not to say what's currently offered can't be strengthened. And actually, NYSCADV is working very hard and aggressively to get a lot more trainings out the door and available to all of you so that new staff can be trained. You know, we have a DV 101 framework training that was already offered last quarter. We're looking to create e-modules of that training so it is accessible anytime service providers need to train new staff. And we're really looking to all of you as providers to help us frame an aggressive training schedule for 2022 and beyond. We don't think the state needs to take over this responsibility. We really do believe that advocates should be responsible for training advocates. And we know that, you know, as a federally designated training and TA provider for the state of New York, NYSCADV should retain that role, just like other states rely on their state domestic violence coalitions to train and provide TA to service providers. So for all of these reasons, and frankly, many more, our recommendation to the legislature is that they just remove this proposal from the executive budget because it's not there yet. It needs to be revised. It needs to be fully considerate of domestic violence advocates' feedback. It needs to really address what the challenges are right now. And most important, it should not be increasing New York's oversight of domestic violence programs. We don't need that. We are already, I think, the most regulated not-for-profit that I can think of. I can't think of another group of not-for-profits that are under the oversight and regulatory authority of 5 state agencies. And this would now add a 6th, DOH. So this is not moving us in the right direction. And we are speaking out pretty loudly. We've informed OPDV, and we certainly provided the legislature with our testimony to say we don't think this is the right approach to manage training and TA for new DV advocates. So that really covers our budgetary requests. Before we move on, I want to see if there's anything. Brittany, can you help me in the chat?
Hey, Joan. No questions. We've had a couple of comments, one around OCFS being able to tell the total programs have been paid annually under the per diem model as far as figuring out a number. And also just a statement around this proposal being detrimental to programs. The reporting requirements are time consuming and redundant potentially, and concerns generally around what this would mean for programs.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have a question, how much is budgeted for OPDV?
Oh, for the Training Institute? That's a great question. Thank you. $289,000 is the increase in OPDV's budget for the Training Institute. Okay, and yes, Yolanda, okay. So now that we're done with our actual budget requests, I know some of you on participating today might be well familiar with our toolkit that we create and the script and Q&A and activities. If you'd like to drop off now as we cover those logistics, the logistics side of our Budget Advocacy Day, please feel free to do so. But I'm going to now shift and talk a little bit more about the actual advocacy we're going to be doing on Budget Advocacy Day, or really around Budget Advocacy Day. Oop. Okay, so first, generally we want legislators to know, certainly of course the specifics on the budget, but generally we want them to understand that New York has the highest demand for domestic violence services in the country. That's consistent. We're number one, unfortunately. That requests for services increased at the start of the pandemic and really have remained quite elevated, even though we're nearly 2 years in. And the variety of challenges that domestic violence service providers are now experiencing. There's so many different fronts, so many different challenges. When you think about, just keeping staff and clients safe, healthy, their well-being during this very difficult time, dealing with the staffing issues, as I already mentioned, during this great transition of individuals out of jobs that they are currently holding and into new ones. The VOCA cuts that we spoke about earlier, but it's not only the VOCA cuts themselves. I think there's a broader context here with respect to funding for domestic violence services broadly in New York State. Funding has remained stagnant. In the VOCA cut situation, we're experiencing significant cuts. That's because New York State relies exclusively on federal funding, with a few exceptions, but primarily the funding that New York State uses to fund domestic violence services is federal funding. So that means that we're at the behest of the federal government. When those grants remain level, we don't see any increase because the state doesn't contribute any of its own general revenues to pump us up. So very stagnant funding year after year. And of course, this year experiencing significant cuts on the VOCA grants. And then again, just that administrative burden that we have, whether it's looking at the per diem reimbursement issue specifically, or the fact that we deal with so many different state agencies, as someone put in the chat, the regulatory burden, the reporting burden, it's excessive. All the contracts are under different grant cycles. Other states do not function this way. New York is really unique in its funding of domestic violence services, and it's not positive. To give you some information, and this will be included in your packet, and you'll certainly be getting these slides as well. We don't have the final numbers for NNEDV's 2021 census yet. So we are continuing to use the numbers from 2020, which did show a dramatic increase in need across that one day in New York State. So that's really because of the pandemic, right? So we were comparing 2019 to 2020. And on that day in September 2020, we saw more than 8,300 survivors getting help. That number was pretty evenly split among survivors receiving residential versus non-residential services. But I think the most important number is that 1,900 requests for help went unmet. And that's what we really need to focus on. and the fact that 750 domestic violence survivors were looking for housing and didn't get it. So these are the numbers that I think will really make this situation understandable to legislators, that the demand is really high. And I don't think we see it going down anytime soon. And that's why funding cuts at any level, is not something that we can tolerate, and they shouldn't tolerate. So I hope that you're in the process of scheduling meetings with legislators now. You're responsible for scheduling your own meetings because, we're in this virtual environment. Our budget advocacy day is February 15th, but if there's a date time that works better for you or for a legislator that's outside of February 15th, please feel free to move ahead. It doesn't have to be specifically on February 15th. We're also here as NYSCADV to participate in any meetings that you schedule, as long as we're available. So if you feel, that you'd like one of us on the policy staff to participate, just let us know when you're going to be meeting. And if we can make it, we certainly will try to do so. We'll let you run the meeting, but if, it makes you feel a little more confident or secure, just let us know and we're happy to be there if we can. Schedule as many meetings as you have time for. If you only have time for one meeting, that's fine. That's really fine. Do that. Most meetings will last about 20 or 30 minutes. It's really unusual for them to go beyond 30 minutes. And you certainly want to, if you're able to meet, you can always thank the legislator afterwards, social media or otherwise, for making time to meet with you. You want to reach out to the office scheduler to schedule the meeting, or if you have a contact within the office, feel free to go to them as well. And don't be too concerned if you're not able to meet with the legislator or there's no commitment that the legislator will be there. Sometimes they'll pop in, even if you weren't expecting them to do that. But if you're meeting with the legislative director, the legislative aide, an intern, it's really okay because I'm sure of it, they convey all of the information that they learn from you to the legislator. And sometimes they're able to really devote a little more time to our issue than the legislator themselves. If you don't know who your legislator is, we've given you some links to go ahead and find out who your legislators are. Or you can contact Brittany, our public policy coordinator. Her email is there, and it's also going to be on the final slide as well. Before you meet or talk to legislators, it's always a good idea to familiarize yourself with them if you're not, familiar with them already. You can always look at their website, which contains a lot of information about them. You can see, going to their press, see what issues they're writing about, see how long they've been in office, see what committees they sit on. It's a good idea just to Google them, see what kind of press they're getting, just to get a general flavor for what they're speaking out about. And then you can tie whatever those issues are into your discussion. Certainly make sure you know if it's going to be a Zoom meeting. I'm finding legislators are asking us as advocates to set up meeting invites for them, which is fine. Or if they prefer just a telephone call, that's fine as well, but just make sure you understand what they'd like you to pursue. And you want to review all of the materials that we provide to you in terms of the messaging. We do have a social media toolkit, we have a script and Q&A, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but make sure you review those materials and you really know what you're going to ask the legislator to do, because you do have a relatively short time frame of 20 minutes or so. That doesn't give you a lot of time to sort of deliberate. Make sure you understand in your own mind what you're going in with hoping to accomplish and the asks that you're going to be making. If you are meeting, be sure to introduce everyone from your group and identify their roles. It's a good reminder, even if you think the legislator or staff knows who you are. And as we discussed earlier, share stories of survivors, the reality of your work, what's happening in your local community, to all make it really relevant to the legislator. answer their questions as best you can. Be honest. Don't be argumentative if they disagree. That's okay. It's politics. Certainly, if they ask you a question that you don't know the answer to, just offer to follow up. NYSCADV is available if you have questions, or we're happy to follow up with any legislator if need be. So, feel confident that it's okay to tell the legislator, I'm going to have to get back to you on that. I'm not quite sure. And always thank them for whatever support they can give to our issue. However, they want to parlay that, we want to really be thankful and acknowledge their support. So in terms of our Budget Advocacy Day materials, all of this information is going to be available on our website. We're hoping to circulate a link to the page on our website. If not later today, then early next week, maybe Monday, which should give you quite a bit of time before your meetings to review all the material and get comfortable with it. We will be providing materials for you to pass along directly to legislators. So we have a letter for them. If you want to send it by snail mail, I don't know if anyone's doing that these days, but we didn't want to be remiss in providing you with a letter that walks through those 4 budget requests. We have a specific fact sheet available on the proposal to train and certify domestic violence advocates. We have the census information, both the state summary as well as a nice flyer if you'd like to pass that on. But we do have a draft email that you can tailor any way you wish to send to legislators. You can tweak that if you want to request a meeting or confirm a meeting, but it's probably the best way to engage with the office if you're not picking up the phone and calling to request a meeting. For you all, in advance of your meetings or discussions with legislators, we do have talking points on each of the budget requests, as well as some related Q&A. It's hard to predict what legislators might ask about our budget requests or information at large, but we did our best to give you a few, not to overwhelm you. We also did include information about another proposal that the governor has in her executive proposal that would extend protections for domestic violence services under the human rights law. So this would ensure that employment agencies and labor organizations and creditors and a whole slew of others couldn't discriminate against domestic violence survivors. We think that's a really great proposal, so we have no issues with it. I don't know if anyone will ask you about that, but there is information in the toolkit should you get asked. And then we also have our social media toolkit. We really do encourage you to engage on social media as part of your Budget Advocacy Day activities. We have a couple of hashtags that we've been using for the past few years. The New York State DV funding hashtag, as well as safety for number 4 survivors. The toolkit includes shareable graphics for you. It includes this beautiful, nice Zoom background that I'm using today, some sample posts and tweets. So like I said, all of this information should be available to you through a link that will be posted on the DV listserv either later today or Monday. So I'd like to stop there to see if there's any questions in the chat that we need to address. Anything, Brittany?
I'm not seeing anything, but if folks have questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat, or you can send anonymously to Joan or myself. Oh, there is one. In reference to demand for DV services, what is the year over year between 2019 and 2020?
Does that refer to the census, the NNEDV census?
Yes.
So the so I think what's being asked is how the 8,300 survivors relate to the 2019 number. And I think the 2019 number was somewhere in the area of 5,500. So it was far fewer, but I would really want to double check that and get it out. But I think it wasn't double, but it was a significant increase. I think we were saying it was a 2,500 person increase who got services on that day. So whatever 8,300 minus 2,500 would be. I hope that answers the question. I'm sorry, my memory is not that great. Well, as we're still giving people time to put questions in the chat, I just want to thank everyone for their participation today, as well as in support of Budget Advocacy Day. Your role is really critical, and we really want to support you in your work. So feel free, if there's more information you need, please ask us in the chat, and we'll make sure it's included in the toolkit. You could always reach out to me, here's my email, or to Brittany, or anyone on the NYSCADV staff if you have specific questions, whether it relates to the budget asks in particular, those proposals, the Article 7 proposals, or just general understanding of your legislator. You know, we'd be happy to share information we know about various legislators you might be meeting with if we're familiar with them. So please reach out if you do have any questions. I've talked a lot. I can't believe we're almost out of an hour's time, but I will remain on for the next few minutes to see if there are additional questions. And like I said, if not, please feel free to reach out by email. Thank you all for participating today. I'm glad you were here.
Joan, one more final question. Time frame when the toolkit will be available?
If not later today, I think Monday for sure. Thank you.